that today the track 3 is on women and employment. Women have been underrepresented in the society, in the labor force, and we've been hearing a lot of talk related to the decreasing and declining participation of female labor force. The details of it, the demand and the supply side factors, and the questions and answer related to it, which many of you I know must be having, will be dealt with by ma'am, Ashwini ma'am, Ritu ma'am, and Sandhya ma'am, who's going to moderate the session. I would briefly introduce the speakers, although they need no introduction. Sandhya ma'am, who's going to moderate the session, is the chairperson of the Center for Public Society, Habitat and Human Development at the School of Development Studies, Tata Institute for Social Sciences. She's been a consultant for projects funded by World Bank, Asian Development Bank, UNDP, and so on. Her current empirical work focuses on sustainable development goals, both across Indian states and also among the T20 countries. Dr. Ashwini Deshpande is the professor at Ashoka University. She's the founding director of the Center for Economic Data and Analysis at Ashoka University. Dr. Ashwini has been working on the economics of discrimination and affirmative action with a focus on caste and gender in India. She received the Exim Bank Award for Outstanding Dissertation in 1994, the 2007 VKRV Rao Award for Indian Economist Under 45, and Scotch Award for Gender Economics in 2022. Now we come to Dr. Ritu Dewan. Ritu ma'am is the Vice President of Indian Society for Labor Economics, and she was the first woman director of Department of Economics at University of Mumbai. She's the founder member of Center of Gender Economics and is the president of Indian Association of Women's Studies. Her research is linked primarily to issues and concerns of the marginalized group and gender economics. So hereby we welcome all three of our speakers for today, and Sandhya ma'am being the moderator, I now leave the dais to her. Sandhya ma'am, please. Welcome, ma'am.
Good morning, all of you, and very glad to be part of this very crucial discussion on female labor force participation. I think the NSS rounds, the PLFS rounds in the last 2 years has been putting a whole range of factors discussing what is happening and where are the women in the labor force. But I think I'd like to place a more fundamental question: where are women in development? Do we really understand that they're all interconnected? The moment we look at the contradictions that development has posed on women, the pattern in which, if I use a very economics term here, supply side factors, which I hate to use, it is more associated with the way in which societies have shaped themselves. And hence, the focus on patriarchy, the focus on how societies and communities continue to impinge female participation, I think that's where I would like to highlight the concerns at the fundamental level. On the demand side, on the other side, do we really see whether the pattern in which globalization has shaped opportunities? We really know how it has marginalized the already marginal. And I think women were already part of that force which were never visible. And I think the paid and unpaid debate in that sense throws light on how we do not even enumerate women's activities in everyday spaces. Pandemics put up another set of problems, or you can say challenges, where patriarchy and demand side factors further have invisibilized women's positions. I think as a moderator, given the grand scholarship sitting on the dais, I would want them to scale the discussion further rather than talk anymore. My humble request to the speakers is, if I could get about 10 minutes at the end for the audience to raise Q&A, it would be a beautiful way for us to get the minds from the audience also speak out. Thank you. Can I invite Professor Ashwini Deshpande, please?
Thank you very much, and a good morning to everybody. Thank you for being here. Let me dive straight into it because I have a lot of ground to cover. And I am going to show you some tables and slides, but not to intimidate you, but just to sort of show that there is evidence to support the arguments that I'm making. And I'm happy to explain in greater detail in the questions and answers. The problem, as is well known and since has been stated since yesterday, is one of the low level and the decline in female labor force participation rates in India. When you look at the literature on why this phenomenon might exist, you see a lot of explanations that determine what is called the supply side. The supply side means the inability of women to supply their labor in the labor market. So, for example, when they get married, it's harder for women to work even if there were jobs available. When they have young children, women find it difficult to access jobs. There's been a focus on conservative social norms. People have also talked about the role of sexual violence on the streets that doesn't allow women to travel freely to their place of work. There's often a stigma attached to working women, so that families are reluctant to admit that their daughters-in-law or their wives are working. It sort of hits against the male breadwinner model, where the expectation from the man is that he earns the bread that is brought to the family. And there are demands of what feminist economists call reproductive labor. This should not be understood as just the act of reproduction of children, but it's a whole range of tasks of cooking, cleaning, washing dishes, washing clothes, fetching, firewood if that has to be fetched, planning meals, nurturing, caring, taking care of children, taking care of in-laws, providing the emotional support to the family. All of these tasks are predominantly done by women, and that makes it harder for women to access paid employment, even if paid employment were to be available. Each of these issues are extremely important, as we know, and they undoubtedly define women's lives in critical ways. But what I'm arguing today is going to go a little bit against the grain, which is that the relationship of these factors with female labor force participation is less obvious and less clear-cut. Certainly, all of these factors. Some of these factors, I think, have a clearer relationship, but not the others. So I feel that we need to have a discussion of all of these factors. But when it comes to female labor force participation rates, we still have some work to do to figure out why is it that we don't see as many women in paid work as we should be seeing. Now, when you come to India, there are two issues related to the female labor force participation rate numbers. One is, and the two issues, the supply side explanations which I outlined on the previous slide, are given for both of those issues. What are the two issues? One is the low level, and the other is the decline. And typically in the literature, both the level and the decline are explained by the same set of factors. And I want to argue today that we need to think of a possibility that different factors might be explaining the level and the decline. So we need to disentangle the low level from its decline. If you look at the low level, it has been persistent in the sense that even at its peak, depending on which data source you look at, recorded female labor force, and I'm emphasizing the word recorded for reasons that I'll come to in a little bit later, recorded female labor force participation rates never exceeded maximum 40%. 38 is what it is. So if you think of the low level of recorded female labor force participation rates, that's a persistent sort of a phenomenon. However, when we think of Indian women, we must recognize that Indian women are not a homogeneous entity. So even when you think of the low level, there were very important social group differences in the levels of female labor force participation rates. So when you think of Dalit or Adivasi women, scheduled caste and scheduled tribe women, they always had higher labor force participation rates than upper caste women, even within this low level. So it is not as though all Indian women were, exhibiting similarly low levels of labor force participation rates. For upper caste women, there's a lot of literature, I don't have time to go into that, where not working for wages is seen as a marker of high status, that we are so well off that our women don't really have to go out and work for wages. So there is a very important dimension here related to caste and tribal status that we must recognize. When you think of the decline, and I'm going to show you some graphs later on, the decline has been roughly the last 2 decades, right? And most importantly, the recorded decline, at least as far as NSS data is concerned, whether in employment unemployment survey or the periodic labor force survey, that is a rural phenomenon. CMI data, you see a decline both in urban and in rural. ISDS data, you see no decline. And that all of these contradictory things are related to measurement, about which I'll talk a little bit. But let's go with NSS right now, because that's the data set in which you do see a decline. And there you see a decline in rural India, not in urban India. These are important facts to remember and keep them at the back of their mind, because I'm going to come back to these features a little bit later. So now let's step back. I'm sure we all understand it, but it doesn't hurt to remind ourselves of what we mean by labor force participation. So labor force participation rate refers to women or men who are economically active, in other words, in paid work, and looking for work. Both of these will be included in labor as a proportion of economically working age populations. These are individuals who would be counted in the labor force. So you either have to be working or you have to be looking for work. Now, the labor force participation rate by definition is a binary indicator. What does binary mean? It means that you are in the labor force or you are out of it. Now, even though being in the labor force is not only a function of labor supply, I may want to be in the labor force, there is no work for me, and so I give up, as Mahesh had talked about that yesterday, I give up looking for a job. And when the surveyor comes to my house, I say, no, I'm not really looking for a job. So I would have been in the labor force and looking for a job if the labor market conditions were more conducive, but I've just, at the moment, discouraged. I've given up. So my not being in the labor force is not necessarily a reflection of my inability or unwillingness to supply labor. But the labor force participation rate, being a binary indicator, is either you're in or you're out. And in our minds, implicitly poses the issue as one of labor supply. So when women's labor force participation rate is low or decline, people assume that women just withdrew because they don't want to work anymore for all the reasons that I outlined on the previous slide. However, what I want to emphasize is that women's labor force participation doesn't only reflect labor supply. It also reflects conditions of demand. Women typically report lower rates of unemployment than men. In other words, they just stop looking for jobs when they feel that labor markets are tight. And when you see women who are not working for pay, you assume that they just voluntarily exited the labor force and are sitting at home because of all the conservative norms and responsibilities, the factors that I mentioned earlier. But is really labor force participation rate a function of labor supply? Now, when you look at the repeated rounds of National Sample Survey, Employment Unemployment Survey, or individual surveys, primary surveys like I've done with Naila Kabir in West Bengal and several other primary surveys as well, all of these surveys document Indian women's willingness to work if work was made available at or near their homes. What these data highlight are a massive unmet demand for work. In other words, there is demand for work, but women don't have those opportunities. But the second part is also equally important. If the paid work is compatible with domestic chores. And in terms of what the norms are that keep women away from paid work, I've talked about this in a paper with Naila Kabir with the title of which is Norms That Matter. And what we have shown is that it's the predominant responsibility of domestic work, not only of childcare, but cooking, cleaning, washing dishes, maintaining house, taking care of children, elderly care, the whole gamut of tasks. These are predominantly the responsibility of women in the family, even if they are outsourced. So even for those of us who have paid help, it's still the woman who needs to get the work done. So either she needs to do it herself, or she needs to get the work done. The gender division of domestic chores in India and Pakistan is amongst the worst in the world. So women in India spend as much as 10 times more time in doing all these domestic chores than the men do, even though these are household responsibilities. They are not only women's responsibilities. But this predominant responsibility of domestic chores discourages women or makes it difficult for women to access work if work was to be made available. And that's the reason why they cannot access work far away from home. So whether it's in cities or in rural India, if work is available which is at a distance, which involves a lot of commuting, they can't do it because they need to be back home to take care of all the other tasks that are talked about. So now let's come back to low-level questions. So hopefully I've persuaded you that when you see women not in the labor force, it doesn't only mean that it's a function of labor supply. Now in India, unlike in the West, all economic activities, which means activities that get counted in the country's national income, they are monetized, they are paid activities. So when you talk about unpaid work by women, it is typically care work, domestic work, child care, elderly care. In countries like India, developing countries, women do a whole range of economic activities on family enterprises that for which the man would get counted as a worker and hence in the labor force. But when the woman does those tasks, she's not counted as a worker. This is not care work, this is not child care. This is work that is generating an income for the family. So work on family farms, on livestock, fisheries, carpet weaving, kirana shops, good making, preparing food items for sale, all these bhed puri walas that you see on the street. Who do you think boils their aloo before they come and start selling their bhel puri? The woman at home who's boiling the alus, cooking the pyaz, making the chutneys ready, etc. But she's not counted as a worker, whereas the man who's selling the bhel puri, he's counted as a worker, and a whole range of other tasks. These are livelihood activities of the family in which run on the backs of invisible, unrecognized, unpaid, economic work of women. These women are doing exactly the same work that their male counterparts are doing. The men are getting counted, the women are not. And this is the measurement problem, and that's the reason why in IHDS, you don't see a decline, because IHDS counts work by women differently, right? Because they're able to count all this work. So men are counted as workers, not as women. So that's the story about measurement that you need to remember. Now, let's go back to the point I made about FLFP being a binary indicator. Either you're in or you're out. So thanks to the CMI data, along with my student Jitendra Singh, we started to investigate whether it's really an in or out story. Is it that we get in and then we stay in, or we are out and we always stay out? Right? There are some, of course, who are always in the labor force and always out of the labor force. But we use the panel dimension of the CMI data. Panel dimension means the same individuals are repeatedly interviewed every 4 months, right? So we use that feature. And we wrote this paper, which is called Dropping Out, Being Pushed Out, or Can't Get In, decoding the female labor force participation rates of Indian women. And the reason we thought of doing that is in developed countries where you do have panel data, you see women transitioning in and out of the labor force more than once in their lifetimes. So many women around childbirth will either drop out completely or go on half-time or limited time work and then go back to full-time work. And CMI data allowed us actually for the first time to investigate this question. And I don't have time to present that paper, but I'll summarize the results for you. And what we wanted to see was, do Indian women exhibit the same transitions? And if yes, what are the factors due to which they exhibit these factors? So we looked at 12 waves of CMI data between 2016 and 2019. So this is all pre-COVID. And we find that Indian women's female labor force participation rate is marked by volatility and frequent transitions, which means literally every 4 months, you see some women who were not in the labor force in the previous 4 months entering the labor force and some exiting. Some entering and some exiting. And every wave is marked by entry and exit of women. So it's not a function of just being in or out of the labor force. So while with CMI data, which has a more restrictive definition of work, and that's why their estimates are lower than their NSS estimates, on average for the period, we find a labor force participation rate of 14% in CMI. But with the same strict definition of work, without changing anything, if we count the proportion of women who were in the labor force at least once in the 12 waves, it's 44% already without changing anything, right? And so then we started investigating what are the factors. So it's not childbirth, it's not unemployment, it's not changes in household incomes, It's not the income effect. We've checked for all possible reasons that economists give to explain such transitions. And what we really, and the other thing, remember the fact that I made about how Dalit and Adivasi women have always had higher labor force participation rates because there are fewer taboos on public, going out of the work and working. In the transition story, we find that these same women, Dalit and Adivasi women, exhibit a greater number of transitions. So their labor force participation rate is even more volatile. What does that tell us? It tells us that, first of all, it's not an in or out story, that's one. It cannot be social norms because social norms don't change every 4 months. If families are conservative, they don't suddenly become progressive 4 months later and then become conservative 4 months after that. It doesn't happen that way, and so on, right? And so what we conclude in the paper, and I don't have time to show that, what we conclude in the paper is that it must, because we eliminate all supply-side explanations, so we conclude that it must be the case that women work when work is available. And work availability, as we saw in yesterday's panels, has become very precarious, especially for the informal workers. Work is not always available. So it's precarious, it's fractured. So women work when they can, and when there is no work, they have to exit the labor market. And that's really what's going on in this paper. Now, in this paper, so here is a picture of what that looks like. So if you look at the right-hand side graphs, you see the blue bar, which is 0.44, which shows 44% of urban and rural women were in the labor force at least once during these 12 days. But if you count it, the average for the whole period, it's just 14%, right? But when you look at the switches, you realize that even with changing nothing else, no definitional change, you see a 44% labor force participation rate, right? So this is something and this is evidence that you can only get from longitudinal, from panel data. You would not get it from repeated cross sections, right? Now, let me now step back and talk a little bit about another paper, because in this paper, we hint at demand side factors, which is, it must be because of demand for women's labor, but we don't prove it. And now I have another paper in which hopefully I have been able to prove that is the demand side. I'm going to give you a little bit of a glimpse of that paper as well today. So here is one stylized fact about the Indian labor. I think Mahesh showed a similar graph using CMI data. This is looking at the RBI CLEMS data and the World Bank population projections. So this is the red line that you see going up is the total population of working age group, and the blue line is total employment. So you see this widening gap between people who would be in the working age group looking for work and the people who are actually employed. And this is both men and women, and this is a problem that was alluded to yesterday. Here are the figures for male and female labor force participation rates using NSS, EUS, and PLFS, right? And the dramatic decline that you see here is in the blue curve, which is the rural female, right? So this is so even with that difference in the widening gap between demand for jobs and supply of jobs, who gets the worst end of it is really rural women. That's the labor force participation that started declining in 2004 and continued all the way to 2018. And now there's been an uptick because of unpaid work in agriculture. So this is a second stylized fact. So in the second paper, we first look at the changes. There's a technique that economists use called the Blinder-Oaxaca technique, which allows you to decompose what might be the reasons behind that. And we focus on the years in which there's been a drop, and we extend the analysis, and we try to see what changed between the years in which the labor force participation rate dropped, what factors changed that would account for such a drop, right? So I don't want to bombard you with too much technical detail, and here just pay attention to the line that says proportion explained, all right? And you see that between 2004-05 and 11-12, less than a quarter of the decline in female labor force participation rates was accounted for by what are the conventional supply side factors. So 76% of the decline was not accounted for by supply side factors. And between 11-12 and 17-18, only 12.5% of the decline is accounted for by supply side factors. So an even lower proportion of decline is accounted for by supply side factors. So it's really, now you really have to investigate demand side factors here. So to do this, what we had started looking at, we started thinking what else is happening in the Indian economy over this period. And here again, when you look at the sectoral share in total employment and female labor force participation rates in India, again focus on the red line and the FLFP line, which is the blue line. So the top two lines, you see how they run parallel to each other. What is the red line? Is the share of agriculture in total employment. What is the blue line? Is the female labor force participation rate. So we feel that there has to be a connection between the two. That the decline in share of agriculture in total employment and the declining female labor force participation rate, there must be a connection. And that's in fact what we investigate. Then what we did use this, what is known as an RBI CLEMS data. We looked at 27 sectors. You see, first of all, agriculture is still the biggest employer. So you see that line up there in terms of share, but it's gone down from 70% to about kind of 45%, roughly. As far as the other sectors are concerned, they employ a far lower share of people, and you don't see much action going on in the other sectors. So while the share of employment in agriculture has declined, other sectors are not necessarily picking up that slack, right? And you can guess the end of, the punchline of this story, which is, obviously it's rural women. I remember that I said, and so this is really what it is. And these are other graphs showing the same thing. I won't spend time on that. And again, I won't bore you with the technical details of this paper, but we have a paper which is called the demand side story, where we use an instrumental variable, et cetera, et cetera. Again, no need to go into all the technical details. But in the end, we are able to show that it's really the declining demand for women's labor that is coming because of the declining share of agriculture in employment, which was the biggest employer for Indian women. You see, a decline. So that really explains the labor force participation rate decline. Okay. Now, you can also raise questions, remember the measurement part that I talked about, which is what is being measured. And we saw that a large part of economic work that women do doesn't actually get measured, and they don't get counted as workers. So when you think of labor force participation rate declining, you think of proportion of women who are economically active are going down. But Sonal Desai has done some work on this, but there's an excellent paper which looks at the time use survey data by economist Nicholas Lee. And what he finds is that if you look at the pilot time use survey in 1998 and compare the same states in 2019, you don't find a decline in the proportion of economically active women. What declines is the hours that they spend in paid work. That has gone down, and that relates to the fractured availability of work that I talked about earlier. So therefore, what has happened is because they are working fewer hours, many women who are actually in economically active work, they don't get counted as workers by conventional survey methodology, because either they are not working for the majority time in the year, which is one way to count a worker. The other is the 30-day continuous work criteria. So think of a woman who was earlier working for 30 days at a stretch. Now she's working 30 days, but in 10-day stretches. And those 10 days are less likely to get counted by surveyors. And that same woman whose work has now become more fractured is not going to get counted as a worker. And so Nicholas Lee actually demonstrates that. And as, it's not. And so I'm now coming to an end of my, presentation, basically, which is talking about why we need to think of jobs and particularly demand for female labor as the main culprit, rather than focusing on cultural factors or social. And by the way, the one cultural factor we have to focus on is sharing of domestic chores. All you young people are here, so hashtag share the load. That's what you need to remember. It's household work, not your mom's work or not your sister's work. So think of some other stylized facts about Indian women. Indian government has a huge program called the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, which organizes rural women into self-help groups. That has shown a tremendous increase in membership over the same years that you see a decline in female labor force participation rates. They are, actively participating, getting engaged, trying to build livelihood activities. Whether that has happened or not is a separate matter, but there's certainly a willingness for that to happen. female interstate migration for reasons other than marriage. Marriage is still the biggest reason that women move across states, but for migration for reasons other than marriage has shown an increase between 2001 and 2011. The same restrictive norm, the same conservative families, the same sexual harassment on the outside on the street, the same lousy buses, the same groping and highly unpleasant experiences that all of us have had to face in our lives. These same conditions have not prevented women from entering educational institutes of higher learning, which is, whether they fight for their families and come or not, whatever it is, they are here. All of you are here. And women's, tertiary education, women's presence in tertiary education is now at par with men, almost. Gender gaps have, almost been eliminated. I don't know what COVID has done to this, but at least pre-COVID. And so what I'm trying to say is that a lot of the preconditions that existed in other countries for female labor force participation rates to increase are present in India too. Maternal mortality rate, no country in the world has seen an increase in female labor force participation rate with high levels of maternal mortality. And you can imagine why, right? Maternal mortality is mothers dying during childbirth, right? And so that has to come down for women to be able to participate in the labor force. And India has shown an impressive progress on this front, right? So we do have a precondition there as well. We have a precondition in terms of education. But the real problem is that we have had what is called jobless growth. We have had high rates of growth, but without generating commensurate number of jobs. Again, this has been talked about yesterday. I'm not going to detail this. Changing industrial composition, this was also touched upon yesterday. Employment elasticity of output growth, this was also touched upon yesterday. And on farms, so one is lack of non-farm employment opportunities in rural India, but even on farming, the kind of mechanization that has happened in rural India has displaced female labor more than it has displaced male labor. So mechanization has taken over what used to be female-dominated tasks in agriculture. So my colleague Kanika Mahajan has an excellent paper which shows this, and there's other evidence on this front as well, right? So what do we need? First of all, we need labor-intensive manufacturing both in urban and rural India. And certainly we need rural non-farm employment opportunities because the decline is really happening in rural India. And other than being a school teacher or Asha Anganwadi worker, A&M, or a construction work, for women, there are hardly any avenues, or wage labor, of course, in somebody else's farm. There are very few avenues of paid employment. And that needs to change. Whether in rural India or in urban India, we need better transportation. Women should be able to access work easily. But very, very, very important factor from the supply side is that the norms around domestic work have to change. It has to be recognized as household work, not a women's work. And paying women for housework is not the solution. All of us have to share the load. We have to think of it as our work that all of us need to do in the house before we set out to do our work or any other activities that we need to do. So that's it, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. And I think even before we get into our own pointers, I would like to now invite Professor Ritu Diwan. I think the momentum needs to go. Our minds need to continue to think. Professor Ritu Diwan, 30 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And of course, delighted to be here. I've been associated with Symbiosis in some online kind of manners over a period of time. But I think the first physical participation which I'm doing has really been very exciting. I couldn't attend yesterday because, of course, the flight issues being late, etc., etc. And so today I hope to be there for the entire day. I don't have a PPT because I knew what Ashwini was dealing with. I know there's been a lot of debate and presentation of data, and one can't keep repeating in terms of the same information which is there. And data, as we know, is becoming more and more problematic. There's very little which has been collected. What has been collected is not shared. It's like put into jail and not given bail at all. So it's collected and stored and not circulated with us. So, and of course, whatever is there is not comparable. And the norms keep changing, the EPFU, etc., the way the formulations, the e-shram information, etc. But for us, I think over the last several years, and I don't want to romanticize the past so much, but things were certainly, in a way where data was concerned, were much better. There was much more comparison. But now, comparability also. But now I think we have two new sources, which Ashwini mentioned, CMI, of course, and APU, which has also been coming, Azim Premji University. And I hope at some level Symbiosis students also take up some kind of a data source collection and really come up at a national level in terms of presenting information. For me, the fundamental, of course, is the supply we already know is there. It cannot go down. It's not as if women don't want to work. I'm talking of the majority, which is what we calculate as about 78 to, I think 82% is really what we calculate, keeping the SC, the ST, the nomadic tribe, the various other kinds of communities, and of course the Muslim community, which is very much taken out now of the perspective of debate and discussion. And within this, focus primarily on the demand constraints, but the demand constraints from a macroeconomic perspective. And this I consider as extremely important, what has been reducing the demand for labor over a period of time. So earlier, when we used to talk about jobless growth, in fact, growth now, and I'm not using the term development. Development is gone out of any kind of a debate, and discussion. And somehow these terms just not there in discussion anymore. It's just growth and growth and growth. Growth of what, of course, is a different kind of a issue. But within this pattern is not only jobless, but in fact anti-employment policies, which have been implemented over the past several years. And these are really what I would like to focus on. The impact on reducing the demand for labor of both women and men. I think one has to see it in a broader contextualization. So at an overall level, if you see the rankings of India at various components, whether in terms of inequality, in terms of gender gap, in terms of employment, in terms of economic performance, all these have been declining. Not that they were very good to start with, but they're even worse than what they were earlier. And therefore, this entire trajectory of growth which is there has to be really questioned at the fundamentals if you're really to understand why women's labor and men's labor is less in demand. There are many kinds of components, and I will take each policy separately and come to, I think, what is considered as the most important constraint on women's participation, and that is the unpaid work component, on which I've been working, I think, over for 20 years now, and one which also has to be seen from a macroeconomic contextualization. So within this, it's, one, what do we define as a worker? I think that also the term has been changing, and I'll come into that when I talk about one or two very, very major policy changes. But I'd really like to start with where the decline started. The demand in the decline in the demand for labor started very, very dramatically, and that was I think the most greatest shock to the informal economy, and that was 2016 with demonetization. The work which, whatever I'm presenting, of course, theoretical, conceptual, but also based on a whole lot of field work which I've been doing. And when demonetization was announced, now, of course, you've been following all the debates. There's a whole lot of RBI data on demonetization. And I think what was most interesting were the arguments put forward in the Supreme Court case. Of course, they said demonetization was fine. I'm not getting to the judgment of it, but the arguments put forward are extremely revealing, because the kind of RBI data and various other information and sources and studies, etc., which have been done, whether it's in terms of terror funding or employment or cashback in the economy, digitalization, whatever one may talk about, is that surely it has impacted the informal economy the most. And within that, the work which I concentrated on is the construction industry, which runs primarily and historically on cash flows. the daily payments which have to be made not only to the workers but also to the contractors for sand, for construction material, etc., etc. And I think, one of the most painful periods of my time was that 6 months, which was spent in the survey on construction workers, whether it was Andhra, Telangana, Uttarakhand, Maharashtra, very much so, and what they went through in it was not just the changing money. It was wages which were not given. There was just no cash left. And to announce somehow this 4 hours seems to have become a very sacred kind of a announcement. So demonetization within 4 hours, closing an entire nation for the pandemic, first pandemic response within 4 hours, and the kind of impact it has on the majority of the population. And I remember I was hunting for what title to use for my work on demonetization, and only I could think of that. Funny, there was desperation earlier. That's why I said past is not too romantic, but now it's utter destitution. And what they went through during the period of demonetization, particularly not only the first few months, but even after that for a period of time, I don't think there's been any kind of a recovery, at least primarily in the construction sector and also in several other sectors like MSMEs and not SHGs so much because they come under a different kind of definition. But that is something which was really very problematic. Combine it with another policy component which impacts your MSMEs and impacts your informal sector very, very strongly. And within this, trade and retail, where a large number of workers are employed, men and also increasingly the percentage of women. And that is the implementation of the flawed and the very chaotic, confused implementation of GST. Now, let's remember GST is, by definition, is one tax. So to have all the categories of about 20 or 23 categories now rationalized into 4, but rationalized into 4 into a in a very inequitable kind of a manner. I'll come to some of these illustrations, which also led to an impact, a reduction in the demand for labor and a collapse of many small, not only industries, but many small retail shops, etc., which was closed. We cannot discuss, I think, demand for labor without talking about the pandemic. And when I say the pandemic, I talk about the pandemic policy response. It's not so much the pandemic itself, but the kind of policy response which took place. And I think the first, though there had been warnings from December onwards, but it was only in March that we had, I think, what we call the long walk home. And we've all seen the visuals of how a nation of migrants, of 1/3 migrants, was closed down within a matter of 4 hours. And I think the visuals and what we've seen and the way the workers suffered during those first few weeks, it's something I think which is going to haunt our conscience forever. Many of us, of course, I don't think there's anyone who was not involved in helping the migrants in terms of food, in terms of accommodation, in terms of transport to go back. We know there's been a lot of information. I've been writing about it for quite some period of time. And wage arrears, wages not given, no work at all, domestic workers being the first and the most, thrown out because this concept of social distancing, which I don't like to use the term because we are already socially distanced in terms of caste and community and class, physical distancing, really. And the way migrants, I think, were turned into, they're actually the victims of the pandemic and of the pandemic policy, but they were turned into bringing, the terms which were used, even academically, not only in media, is that the migrants brought the pandemic back to the villages. When we know that the situation was extremely different and they really were the victims of what was really done of the policies. And a policy, I think, which was, there was no demand side component to the policy at all. It was all supply side. There's a lot of details on this, which I don't want to go into. But in my fieldwork, the kind of impacts which I found were really it was horrifying what people went through. In parts of Orissa, and I'm sure everywhere, I'm just talking of the areas which I covered, Orissa, Bihar, UP, Gujarat, parts of Maharashtra, men and women working for 8 hours a day for 15 rupees. You know, and this was the time when we were saying that at least for a period of time, implement, don't call it the UBI, the Universal Basic Income, but at least put some cash into people's accounts to be able to survive where food is concerned. The free food scheme came after a period of time, even though we have the NFSA, that is the National Food Security Act, which is guaranteed in the constitution of our country. The worst impacted, of course, I really don't know what to say, who is the worst, but what I came across in my field work was sex workers who were, because remember, this is a period of physical distancing, who were reduced to charging 7 rupees an encounter. And I think the violence which they faced, and you know, the physical violence and the other kinds of violence which they face is something which can never be articulated in strong enough words. Now, within this is also a long-term kind of an impact. It's not only the quantity of labor. For me, it's also the quality of labor. And remember that the pandemic comes at a time when the NFHS data has already shown us, the National Family Health Survey, that 76% of Indian rural households already, NFHS 4 and NFHS 5 later, could not afford a nutritious diet. So already undernourished, plus no food availability, a decline in pulses and cereal consumption of 60%. This is something which has been identified through various kinds of data sources, whether macro or micro and meso very much in particular. So what this really does, it impacts and remember, this is the period when the midday meal was stopped in most states except for 1 or 2. ICDS was closed. About 64% of children did not even get dry rations for a period of 6 months. So what you have is a huge decline in nutritional levels within the first 6 months of sections of people who were already lower nutrition. So this is something which reflects the capacity to work of the present generation. And if we don't see children as children in a closed context, but see them as a future workforce, it's already impacted the quality and the capacity, physical capacity to work of the future workforce. And why I'm emphasizing so much on the physical quality, because that's where the majority of work is available. You know, this work from home, what we talk about, it's a good or a bad thing, applies to a very, very small section of people. Those who can afford, those who are digitalized, those who can manage to be at home, who afford electricity and various other kinds of communities in this particular context. There was also what I call, under the camouflage of COVID, there were several policies which were passed, which again impacted very dramatically the demand for labor of men and specifically of women at an overall macro level in all sectors. One, of course, which we know the longest historical struggle in the history of the world, and that is the Farm Acts and the kind of impact the Farm Acts had. Now, I'm not going into the details of the Farm Acts and the debate, etc. It's all there. A lot has been written out. But the attack on agricultural sector, and which is one of the most crucial sectors where employment is guaranteed for 85% of the working women. However, we may calculate that 85% or the number of working women in the country. Remember, agriculture for the last 6 years is the only resilient sector, in the sense that it is the only one which has shown a positive growth. Even during the first 2 years of the pandemic, even before the pandemic, the growth rate was about between 3 and 3.5%. But industries already declined into a negative, still into a negative. So to expect, and you know, this comes out in our fiscal architecture, this comes out in the kind of, loan NPAs which are given out, and it's going to come out again in the budget in another 10 days from now. And that is to expect growth of jobs from the manufacturing sector, I think is really wishful thinking. It's not going to come, primarily because already the data is out that your FMG, that is your fast-moving goods, which are there, or the demand even for food items and consumption items has been going down steadily, because the income in the hands of the majority of the population, that is your demand component, is at one of the lowest levels. So you have your income inequalities, poverty inequalities, all of them which have increased over a period of time. And I seriously call this the attack on agriculture. It hasn't stopped. The MSEPs, that is the minimum support price, which is guaranteed, announced for wheat, is the lowest level of increase of MSEPs in 14 years. There is also the introduction of a ban on exports at various levels, even when the agricultural sector is resilient. There is now, this was, I think, in September or in October, that a LOC, that is a letter of credit, only for export, that you can export only if you have a guaranteed LOC, which applies to larger organized agricultural components and not to farmers, cooperatives or individual farmers who cannot get an LOC for various technical and procedural and, of course, capital intensive kinds of lectures. Now, when I say agriculture and I talk about the quality of labor, not only the quantity of labor, please remember that this resilience sector, the one which is still growing, the one which faced the maximum burden of the unemployed because of the kind of pandemic policy that is due to reverse migration which took place during this period. We have witnessed it visually, and of course it has been captured academically in data and in the analysis also, that this kind of increasing dependence of the agricultural sector also increases the level of what we term as self-exploitation. That is, you work harder, you eat less, and at the same point of time, you're supporting a larger proportion of workers than you actually did. So again, your quality of the workforce, not only the present, also in the future. There's another policy change which impacts the labor market, formally, of course, and informally, very much so. And that is the labor codes which have been introduced. 2019, it started in December 2019, just before the pandemic, and then they have been introduced continuously in Parliament, even during the entire period of the pandemic. Now, these 4 labor codes replace every labor law which has been struggled for in our country for over a century, whether it's BD workers or through the freedom movement or V.V. Giri, our first president, who was a labor leader and a trade unionist. And what you have is a total redefinition of what is work, who is a worker, and what is a workplace. Now, this is, of course, going to have impact on the way we calculate data, on the measurement kind of a component. But the major change which has come, which is going to impact, of course, men, but primarily women, is the definition of a worker. And a worker is now one who is employed in an enterprise or an industry. So what it does, it precludes work from any kind of a benefit which any worker legislation in the future or in the present might bring about to anyone who is in private employment. Leaves out all your domestic workers. Of course, Sumangala workers are out. Leaves out the apprentices and puts into a grey shade those who work for a contractor at home, what we call home-based workers, whether BD workers or, designers of Kolhapuri chappals, etc., etc. There is also an increase, and this is by policy, an increase in the workday under the labor law from 8 hours to 10 hours. And in emergency situations, emergency means emergency for the employer, not for the employee, up to 12 hours. Now, this is something we witnessed in Mumbai during the textile strike with the closure of the formal sectors, etc. And what this does, the increase in the workday, that it throws out one entire shift of workers. Instead of 8 hours, if it is 10 and 12 hours, 1/3 of the demand of labor in these sectors is out, officially out. There were 2 states which tried to increase this to 16 hours a day. I mean, can you just imagine anybody working for 16 hours a day? But luckily for once, the Supreme Court came and said, no, 16 hours is not acceptable. Now, please remember also ILO and all other international definitions put 8 hours work as what should be correct and human and humane. I think those are terms which you really have to get back into discussion. Of course, bonus, whatever it was given, is out. Earlier, there was a calculation which was given by law, but now the bonus will be decided by the executive, that is by whichever officer is sitting on duty. There is no social security guaranteed. And I don't like to use the term social security. It's a very reductionist kind of a term. In fact, these are rights, you know, rights of existence, rights of life, rights of livelihood, and I call them social rights rather than social security. Nothing is guaranteed. What is existing has been withdrawn by law, and it has been said that social security, in quotes, will be schemes, will be announced and shared. Not maybe announced and shared and not. I'll try 5 minutes, 6 minutes maybe. Okay, so there's a may to it and it is not a shall to it, which is what has been there for earlier. And of course, I mean, the issue of violence, which we talk about. And here again, this is what I call the macroeconomic basis or the macro basis of violence. It's, of course, individualized violence is very much there. It's increasing, very, very visible, actualized. But the fact that now it is institutionalized, because what the Labor Code 2 does, it separates sexual harassment from occupational safety and health. And this, I think, is one of the most dangerous components and the most dangerous constraints which has emerged on the participation of women. Like I said, there's normalization. There's what I call a macro silence on violence against women. I mean, you never hear of anybody talking, you know, urinating on an airplane passenger becomes national news and people talk about it and condemn it, but there's no condemnation of the release of rapists, you know, before their time, etc. So this macro silence is something which really has to be debated. No space for struggle, women removed from boards. It used to be half earlier of all employment boards, women's reservations, but now it's reduced to 1/3. And of course, your rights of struggles have all been called out. There are many other laws, the forest protection laws, which have been diluted, environmental laws, and Joshinath, which is being talked about right now, very much a debate. We had taken up an issue and said that please have an EIA, that is an environmental impact assessment. But the project was deliberately broken up into smaller projects to try and escape the EIA. So these are the kinds of very long-term. And of course, when we know it's forest, we are attacking the issue of CPRs, and that is your common property rights, which is where primarily your Adivasis and your tribals and a huge amount of rural population are dependent on. There's monetization of assets, very much. I mean, I'm not talking only about airports and railways, etc., but also LIC. And why Life Insurance Corporation becomes extremely important, link it up with the national policy of privatization of insurance. And this is the work which I'm doing right now, two works which I'm doing right now. One is insurance, gendering insurance, that how do you understand? And the first data I came across, I was really quite amazed that 48% of LIC agents in India are women. This was something which really one had never not known about. The issue of unpaid work is just huge. But I also feel that having worked on it for almost 2 decades, at a macro level, at fieldwork level, that it's been given a bit too much importance in terms of as a constraint on women's participation in the workforce. One, please let us see unpaid work not as a micro issue. It is not a household issue. At some level, it is. Of course, men should share more in the housework, etc., which is understood, you know. But it's not a question of you wash 2 dishes and I'll make 2 chapatis. That's not the point at all. The point is reducing the burden of unpaid work at a national macro level for men and for women. And for me, this hit me the most when I saw those single male migrants. So, you know, when we talk about unpaid work, we also have to take those components into mind. And here, I just give me 2 minutes, is what has been done over the last few years. And this was somehow one of the most cynical policy changes which came about, and that is when there was women were working from home or sitting at home during the pandemic. During the pandemic, the subsidies on cooking, clean cooking energy were removed. It's not only the increase in cost. Your Ujjwala was stopped in September 2020. DBTK was changed. That is your direct benefit transfer of kerosene, which when you cannot afford gas, the majority uses kerosene, was withdrawn. And every month, the fuel, those who were selling kerosene were allowed to increase the price by 50 paisa. Now, we don't even recognize what is 50 paisa today. But 6 rupees increase in 1 liter of kerosene over the year when your incomes are declining dramatically because of your COVID policy and various other kinds of inequalities is something which is very problematic. And in fact, what is happening is the collection of fuel and firewood, not only in rural areas, has gone up, and therefore the time poverty of women, but also in urban areas, and therefore rag picking and going into waste for collecting waste for cooking is something which has huge health impacts on women and, of course, all those who live within the house. Fiscal architecture, I'm not even getting into, we are going to see it. But to have, a 5% tax on wheat, of a GST of less than 25 kilos, which household buys 25 kilos or, more than 25 kilos of wheat at a particular point of time? So who does it really benefit? 12% on stationery, not acceptable when education has become such a problem in terms of the digital divide, which is actually increasing, particularly for women. Diamonds, the GST is only 1.25%. And this has only increased in the last few weeks. It used to be 0.25% earlier. And this again, I think we really have to see every component from a gender aspect. There is no GST on Rudraksh malas. There is no GST on Sindoor. There is no GST on Mangal Sutra. There is no GST on bindis. There is no GST on various kinds of this is what I call a fiscally created, ideal, majoritarian Indian woman. One who does not work, who dresses and behaves in a particular kind of a way. And this is something I just dread that we are going to see again in the new budget. I'm not even going to get into MSMEs and what has been done, whether majority are women, or the fact that the share of indirect taxation has gone up so very dramatically that the corporate sector today contributes only 24% from 36% for about 5 or 6 years ago to the tax revenue. So all I can do is appeal to you all to try and understand this upcoming budget, and I think the entire contextualization of women and of labor at a very broad level in a very concrete manner in the context of the lived reality of who are the citizens of the Republic of this country. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think the topic is such that we can keep conversing for many, many hours. But I think two very quick points which come out is that we need to demystify our own understanding of the idea of what women... I would again bring back the question of development within the larger idea of labor force participation. And I think two stalwarts have already put forth their ideas and presented the concept of how the demand and supply side are getting mediated within the larger idea of how we contextualize women. Can we quickly have 3 questions from the great crowd that we have? I think you're all got the right to talk. We talk about rights. It's your right to ask questions over here. Only 3 questions.
Yeah, my question is to ma'am, to anyone, Ritu Diwan or Ashwini Deshpande ji. It's about like what message you would like to give for the ladies, because I think somewhere even the mindset of a ladies needs to be changed, right? Because somewhere I think we are responsible for us. No doubt, there is a pressure, there's a social pressure from our parents. We have been taught to live, from beginning, from when you're a child, or like you are, तुम हमेशा सानिध्य में रहते हो, कभी पिता के सानिध्य में रहते हो, कभी पति के सानिध्य में रहते हो, और फिर बूढ़े हो जाने पर बच्चों के सानिध्य में रहते हो. तुम उनके लिए जीते हो, उनके लिए मरते हो. So what is the message you would like to give for the ladies? They need to come out, right? So what's your thought? Like, I want to hear from you all.
Yeah, you were wanting to ask. Introduce yourself. We'd like to know all of you. Yeah. I think it's switched off. Introduce yourself and...
Good morning, ma'am. To all the esteemed panel here. From my side, I'm Vimarsh Khanna. and I'm a first-year student at Symbiosis School of Economics. And I have a very normal question regarding the female labor force participation rates in India. We do know about the inverted U-shape hypothesis and its defining and how it defines how females participate in the labor force. But how does the theory, how does the hypothesis stand in the Indian context? Has India completely phased out of it, or is it still a lot of work needed to be done in order to ensure that females participate highly in the labor force?
Yeah, this one more there. Yeah, there.
Good morning, all. This is Radhika. So, since we are discussing women in the workforce and labor, very recently, this week itself, we had interesting developments, especially concerning the paid menstrual leave. A petition being filed in the Supreme Court, as well as one of the state governments taking a step towards it. So while on one hand, we've had instances, for example, the sugarcane workers in Bede, where they had to undergo forceful womb removal surgeries. And on the other hand, we have this counter arguments, mostly misogynist, where they say that it might affect the productivity of workplaces. So as economists, this is a question open to all the panelists. How would you see the significance of paid menstrual leave? Thank you.
Yeah, there are two more over there in the center. Good
morning, ma'am. My question is sort of from a personal example and from the point of view of an employer. So a very close acquaintance of mine runs a very small firm, and I know that he respects women, but unfortunately from his past experience, all the women of our age that he employs, after a couple of years, they voluntarily drop out because they want to get married or some other responsibilities. So from the point of view of the employer also, he expects some kind of commitment irrespective of the gender of the employee. So, and for many employers who are especially small employers, it's not possible to provide the kind of flexibility that women require in order to manage between all their priorities. So I don't see how anyone is to blame here, either the employer or the women employees. So I want to know your thoughts about it.
One last question, just one more, because we need time for the speakers to also respond. Yeah.
Hi, ma'am. I'm Ananya Acharya. I'm a second-year master's student. My question is headed towards Ashwini ma'am. Ashwini ma'am said in her presentation that women work when they can, and in a report published by the Behavioral Insights Team UK, they mentioned that part-time work can help women come out more in workplaces. So can more part-time work in formal workplaces enable women, enable the female labor force participation rate to improve in India?
Can you answer? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for all the questions. Let me start by the more database question first, which is the U-shaped hypothesis. So the U-shaped hypothesis about female labor force participation relates to income levels, right? So as incomes of countries increase, labor force participation drops, and then it starts to increase. In India, first of all, even in globally, that evidence is not as clear-cut as you probably believe it to be. In India, certainly we don't have, there's been no, so if you don't draw labor force participation rates by income levels of states, you don't see that U-shaped pattern. What you definitely see in India is U-shaped in relation to education. So illiterate women and highly educated women have the highest labor force participation, and it is lowest in the intermediate levels of education. And that is related to the point I was making about availability of work or demand for jobs. So think of women who have class 10 education, let's say, that, or class 8, right? Now, if such a girl is in a village or even in a city, What are her options? You might see a boy with that level of education working in a mobile repair shop or working in some, neighborhood, some repair shop or some delivery boy, etc. That's the kind of work this woman can easily do. But there are no opportunities of that kind available. So we have to think of intermediately educated women and what opportunities we can create for them. And so that's about the U shape. Now, the other three questions are sort of all related, and in a one-word answer to that would be patriarchal norms mindset, but that doesn't explain all that much. So let me start about, so what do women themselves think, right? Whether a woman or a man or, we are all products. The way we think, we are products of our circumstances. We take social norms as given and we behave in a way that we think society expects of them. But first of all, social norms are not written in stone. So when you look at Europe today, where you find higher labor force participation rates of women, they were not always this way. Even 100 years ago, women didn't go out except very poor women didn't go out and work in paid work, right? What changed? One, the Industrial Revolution, but more than that, it was really the influenza epidemic of 1919 and the First World War that led to high levels of mortality among men that pushed women into the labor force like never before. So the turning point in Europe came because of these very seminal, you call it exogenous shocks or whatever. Mindsets change afterwards. So there's this classic question of what changes first. Do people start thinking differently? Or do material circumstances change that lead to people thinking differently later on, right? And this is related to, somebody used the word blaming employees. I mean, there's no question of bad people. This is not about good people and bad people and blame being laid on somebody or the other, right? People behave in a way that makes sense to them given their circumstances, right? So if you want their behavior to change, you have to change the circumstances. If tomorrow women go out in large numbers and work in paid employment, other things around them will change. So you see families of working women, for example, women who go outside for, their families are organized differently than families of women who don't go outside and work, because women are in the house doing, working at, and there are papers, by the way, in the West that find that children of working mothers are much more independent than than stay-at-home mothers, because their mothers are not at home, so children have to start doing their own thing. So that's about mindset. How do you change mindsets? Change the circumstances. Create jobs, let women go out, mindsets will change. Not tomorrow, not day after. It'll take time, but it'll change. On the question of what should an employer expect, and is it not reasonable for the employer to not employ women because that woman is going to get married and have children, right? So that's very famously called the marriage penalty or the motherhood penalty. So the whole idea, the whole argument that feminist economists make is that marriage and parenthood are social needs. We get married, we produce children because society needs to reproduce itself. While the mother pays the penalty for it, the father gets a reward. So there are studies in the United States that look at husband-wife couples and they track their individual salaries. When the first child gets born, the mother's salary drops either because she's completely withdraws or she does half-time. The father usually gets a wage increment because now he has an extra hand to, extra mouth to feed. PhD students who are working in American universities, or tenure track professors, they have 6 years in which to work, do their research and produce the research that will give them tenure. When couples like that have children, they get an extra year added to their tenure track. And there is an excellent paper that shows that men, the new fathers, use that extra year to ramp up their research because they get that extra year to produce more, whereas mothers are just struggling with the new baby. So my point is that what the marriage and the birth of a child is a social need. It's equally, the mother and the father both have had the child, right? Why should the mother get a labor market penalty and the father get a labor market reward? That individual friend of yours, an employee, is a very nice person, I'm sure, so there's no blame being assigned to anyone. But society, the labor markets are gendered institutions in that labor markets work to penalize women and to reward men for the very same act. And that's what needs to change about labor markets. It's not about individual mindsets, and it's not about people being good or evil. That's not what it is. And I think that relates now to your point about menstrual leave. There's a lot of discussion in feminist circles about if men were to have conditions, of life conditions such as menstruation or menopause that women have to deal with, the workplaces would be organized very differently. The fact that we can't talk about menstruation or menopause in a reasonable manner as just a biological phase that people go through is because these are women's issues. Workplaces are organized in keeping in mind very simple and basic example of that is the AC temperature. You will see in offices, women are always carrying shawls because the air conditioners are set to the temperature that men find, or height of podiums, or lapel mics, which is very hard to tie to a sari, etc., etc. So you think of examples even in academic institutions, it's all geared towards the representative person who's the male, right? And so whether it's menstruation, whether it's menopause, or childbirth, these are all human phases or conditions that we all have to go through, and they should be regarded as people's issues, or as workers' issues, not as women's issues. And the minute we start thinking about it that way, then workplaces, rules, regulations, patterns, norms, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, all that will start. But that's related to the fact that I said about the employer discrimination, which is, by the way, it still makes a discrimination. That not because your friend is a bad person, but it still is discriminatory that 50% of the workforce, which should be 50%, it's not in India, but 50% of the population has to face a penalty for what is essentially a social process.
Yeah, not repeating what Ashwini has said, but just one or two additional points. One, of course, is this context of women, and we always hear that women are women's worst enemies and all these kinds of statements which are there. But our experience, of course, has shown that, yes, it's a mindset, it's a thinking. And also, I remember the Planning Commission when Abhijit Sen and Saida had formed this committee of feminist economists from the 10th plan onwards. We weren't only women. We had Santosh Mehrotra, who was there with us. We had Jean Drez. We had Shiv Kumar. And we believe very strongly that men are part of this entire struggle for equality. And that brings me to the first question, I think in some of the courses which I've taken for you all on gender sensitization, not courses, lectures, is the first question I always ask, what is the opposite of patriarchy? And the answer I always get is matriarchy. And we say, no, the opposite of patriarchy is equality. And that's really what one is looking for, to see it in that broader, therefore, context. There is also this question of what you were saying about the smaller employer. There are two or three aspects to this. I remember when the Bombay textile mills, they closed down, and formal employment and hours of work and higher wages, etc., etc. And they were all thrown out, and they moved to the power loom sector in Goregaon and various other, Bhiwandi and various other parts of Brihan Mumbai. And the workers, the employers there, the power loom employers did not have the capital to pay the same level of wages or the same number of hours as those who were in factories. And I remember we went on strike and we said, when we were helping organize the workers, and we realized that it's not possible. It's not possible for the small employer to pay equal wages. So the demand then became equal wages in terms of equal to the factory level. So therefore our demand became that at least minimum wages. That was one, at a much lower level. The second issue is the kind of facilities. And this is where the context of a welfare state and what you're talking about in Europe and World War, and I mean, Rosie the Riveteer is a documentary you should all see. It's really quite amazing how women came into the workforce and then they were forcibly withdrawn from the workforce. And is the context of supply of fulfillment of the demands of the workers outside the employer ambit. And that is, just in the most fundamental way. Maybe in a small factory or in a small employer's unit, like what you're talking about, it's not possible for the employer to provide a toilet. Separate toilet for women becomes even more problematic. This is where the state has to step in, and that's the context of a welfare state, that you have public toilets which are accessible, of course, which are clean, etc., but also which are affordable. Earlier, I remember in BMC in Bombay, when we started this entire campaign, it used to be called the Right to Pee campaign in Bombay. And we said toilets for men and for women. After that were introduced user fees. So remember this fiscal architecture component which comes in. 2 rupees for men and 10 rupees for women. And we said, why are women being charged 5 times more than men? So they don't access it. They can't go to the beach. They can't go use the road. So they said, no, women start washing the clothes because of the unpaid work component. They quietly take their babies in and start bathing the babies, etc. This is the justification which was given. So affordability is also an extremely important question where welfare is concerned. Third is the policy component. And within the labor laws, you'll see there is one act called the Plantation Workers Act, 1951, fought for, lots of details which are given there, and relates particularly, not only, but mainly to the Northeast, where it says that the employer has to provide subsidized housing and subsidized food for the plantation workers. This has been withdrawn, and it has said that all this subsidized, the cost of subsidized housing and subsidized food will now be borne by the district panchayat, when the district panchayat revenue budget has been reduced so dramatically. So it's kind of a wage subsidy to the larger employers, which is there. There are several other aspects. One is the bead workers, the sugarcane workers, and I think it was the removal of their uterus, which they were doing, and which was written about a lot as a women's issue. But me and another friend, we saw it very differently as a labor rights issue. It's not only a women's issue, it's a labor rights issue also. We filed a case, Indra Jaising and I, we filed a case in the Supreme Court, but 6 years and there's no time to hear this case yet. It hasn't even come up for listing. So there are many kinds of, I think, components, several questions which can also be, flagged off and asked. But please remember that from, I think, even the day that you all joined as students to today, there is a backsliding of women's rights. And this is something you must recognize, and really something which you must take up, and what I call the process of gender de-equalization. Whatever level of equalization had been achieved is now being slowly taken away. So I think the academics, advocacy, action, these 3 A's are always linked to this component. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we are coming to an end of the session, but I think as young researchers, there's a lot of fodder to think. Even when you design your research, and I think that's what your programs will be making you do, I think you need to start looking at complex questions and also start framing the right questions. And I think that's what today's session has done. Start raising questions on what do you mean by equity? What is equality? Is it starting at the same point or starting at different points and trying to reach at the similar outcome, right? Also, when we talk about the norms and issues which are coming not only from the societal level, but I think what you're going to face in the current century is the fact that transformations are going to keep happening very, very quickly and rapidly, be it economic, be it climate change. I think we are, in our studies and tests, have been talking about climate-related displacement unequally impacting women. How are they really coping with those challenges and how they are getting denied with resources? In fact, when Professor Ritu Diwan was talking about toilets, we did a very quick survey of Zilla Parishad offices in Maharashtra. Most toilets, women's toilets, are kept in lock and key, are designed in such a way they are in the end of the corridor. And invariably, the woman has to go to the collector's office to access the toilets. So it's absolutely unimaginable what are we doing, even in contemporary times. We found that even in Chhattisgarh, we found that even in Jharkhand. So let me not just blame Maharashtra for the problems. But fact of the matter is per capita income of a state has not determined rights anymore in India. It is the attitude of the state towards women's participation which is going to define what outcomes it is. So I think your generation next, you may be aspiring to get into such spaces. I feel we need to sensitize ourselves to the nuances of women in in substantiveness, and also understand the gender nuances that are getting done in public spaces. Thank you so much, and I think that's been a beautiful morning session, lots to think, and I think a big round of applause.
I would now request our director, Professor Jyoti Chandaramani, to please come on the stage. I request Ritu ma'am to please come over here. Thank you so much, ma'am, please. Ashwini ma'am. Yeah. Thank you, Ritu ma'am. Ashwini ma'am. Ashwini ma'am. I would request Jyoti ma'am to please facilitate Ashwini ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ritu ma'am. Thank you so much, Ashwini ma'am. Sandhya ma'am?
We need to take a picture with everyone.